Imagine being abandoned in another state, no money, no papers, with an infant in your arms. But you don't give up. You don't break down. You get up and you build your empire out of agony, pain, and strength. This is not just a story. It's the journey of a woman who was abandoned and became a legend in her bakery. Watch this video to the end. Because her revenge isn't a scream. It's the aroma of fresh baked goods and a loud comeback in court with a baby in her arms. Right now, post in the comments what city you're from and what time it is on the clock. I want to know who's watching this story with me. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps others hear stories like this that are being silenced. Click like if you're ready to be inspired. Here we go. This is going to be strong. Ruby Brown had always believed in quiet strength. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Her presence alone had a way of calming storms. For 40 years, she'd been the pillar of her community in Charleston, South Carolina. A retired school teacher with salt and pepper curls, cinnamon skin weathered gently by time, and eyes that still held the spark of every child she ever guided. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, baked pies for neighbors recovering from surgery, and still wrote handwritten thank you notes. She had lived a full life, or so she thought. Her husband, Horace, was the dependable sort. A quiet man with a strong work ethic, he had worked as a contractor most of his life, never too expressive but always present. They had shared 37 years together, some hard, some good, and most, Ruby believed, solid. Children had never come, despite the prayers and the tears behind closed doors. And although she had mourned the absence of motherhood like a limb she never grew, she had made peace with it. Then, just a few months after retiring, Ruby felt something unusual. At first, she chalked it up to age, fatigue, nausea, a touch of dizziness. But when her appetite changed and her stomach grew just enough to make her pull at her dresses, she walked into a clinic just to rule things out. The doctor had stared at the ultrasound for longer than expected, then turned with a cautious smile. "Miss Ruby, you're pregnant." She had laughed, then cried, then laughed again. At 65, she was carrying a miracle. The news struck like thunder in clear skies. Her body, one she had quietly resented for failing her so many times, had found a way. When she told Horace, he had stared at her for several seconds too long. Then he smiled, a small, tight-lipped smile. "Guess the Lord's got a sense of humor," he said, and went back to stirring his coffee. She convinced herself it was shock. And in the weeks that followed, she tried to believe he was adjusting, just as she was. But the signs began to pile like dirty laundry no one wanted to wash. He stopped rubbing her feet like he used to. His phone seemed to always be turned away from her. He spent longer hours at the job, even though she knew his business had slowed. Still, when he suggested a weekend getaway to Georgia, a little pre-baby break he called it, she agreed. Ruby didn't want to be suspicious. She didn't want to be the kind of woman who poked at the seams of her life until everything unraveled. So, she packed 2 dresses, her blood pressure meds, and the tiny journal she had started for the baby, full of prayers and doodles and promises she whispered into her belly each night. The drive was long but scenic. Horace didn't talk much, but Ruby filled the silence with stories, memories, dreams for their unborn child. "Maybe we'll name her Grace," she mused aloud. "Grace for what God finally gave us." They stayed in a modest motel just outside Savannah. It wasn't fancy, but it had clean sheets, a small kitchenette, and sunlight that poured in like warm syrup each morning. The first evening, they had dinner at a local diner. Horace smiled more than usual, even cracked a joke about learning to swaddle. For a few hours, Ruby let herself exhale. Maybe they were finding their rhythm again. But by the second day, the shift was undeniable. Horace was distracted, on his phone, constantly. Irritated when she asked simple questions, like where he wanted to eat or whether he'd pack the vitamins. That night, he claimed he needed some fresh air and stepped outside. Ruby fell asleep alone, one hand on her growing belly, whispering to her unborn child, "It's okay, baby. Mama's here." The next morning, she awoke to silence. The room was colder than usual. His side of the bed was untouched. She sat up slowly, the pressure in her lower back already building. "Horace," she called out. Nothing. She checked the bathroom. Empty. The kitchenette. Empty. His suitcase was gone. Panic hit like a second heartbeat. She tore through the drawers, checked under the bed, looked in the closet. Gone. His toothbrush, his wallet, his favorite plaid jacket, gone. She stumbled to the front desk in her robe and slippers. "Excuse me, have you seen my husband?" she asked, voice trembling. The young clerk looked up, then smiled politely. "Mr. Brown checked out this morning. Said you'd be staying one more night." Ruby blinked. "What? That can't be right. He wouldn't." The clerk simply nodded. "He left payment for one more night. After that, you'll need to provide a card." Ruby reached into her purse and handed over her debit card. The clerk swiped it, declined. She handed over the credit card, declined. She tried her phone. No signal. The room phone had been unplugged. She sat down right there in the lobby, one hand on her belly, the other covering her mouth to keep from screaming. The baby fluttered softly, unaware of the world collapsing around them. By sunset, her phone finally pinged. A single call. "Horace." She answered, heart pounding. "Horace, where are you? What's happening? Are you okay?" His voice was too calm, too measured. "I filed for divorce, Ruby. It's already done. You'll be served soon." "What? You left me here alone, pregnant?" "I left you a night in the room and enough time to figure out how to get back. You're not helpless." "I'm carrying your child, Horace. We waited for this. I don't know if that baby is mine," he said flatly. "You changed. You started acting like I didn't matter anymore. I'm not about to be trapped at my age." Ruby's throat closed. "We tried for years," she whispered. "We did IVF. I'm not discussing this further. Handle your return. Goodbye." The line went dead. For a long time, Ruby just sat in the room, the walls slowly darkening around her. She didn't cry. Not at first, she couldn't. Her body felt suspended, like if she moved, she might fall through the floor. By nightfall, the tears came. She ate a granola bar she'd packed for the road, sat curled in a corner of the bed, and whispered lullabies to the child still growing inside her. The next morning, she wrapped herself in her scarf and walked to a local church. It took nearly an hour in the Georgia sun, her feet swollen, her mouth dry. She didn't know what else to do. Inside, a young woman named Alicia found her. She didn't ask many questions, just looked Ruby in the eye and said, "We'll help." They got her to a temporary shelter for women, gave her a bottle of water, and let her lie down. Hours passed before she could speak clearly. Eventually, she called her daughter, Tanisha, back in Charleston. When her daughter picked up, Ruby said only 3 words. "He left me." "I'm coming," Tanisha replied. "You just hold on, Mama." It took 2 more days, but Tanisha sent her enough money to buy a bus ticket home. Ruby arrived in Charleston wearing the same dress she left in. Her body ached, her hands trembled. But when she stepped off that bus, her daughter was waiting, arms open, face wet with tears. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Tanisha just wrapped her up like a child and whispered, "You're safe now. Let's go home." Only home was no longer there. The locks had been changed. The mailbox had a new name. A real estate sign stood crooked in the front yard like a final insult. The neighbors looked away. Ruby didn't cry this time. She just turned, got in Tanisha's car, and stared out the window as they drove away. All she had left was her name, and a baby growing stronger each day. And for now, that would have to be enough. Tanisha's apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and baby wipes. It wasn't meant to house a third adult, especially not one reeling from betrayal, heartbreak, and a pregnancy in its final trimester. But Ruby never once complained. She slept on the living room couch, a thin quilt folded neatly over her feet each night, her belongings in a single battered suitcase near the wall. Grief had changed her posture. She had always stood tall, with a back like a gospel cord, solid, unwavering. But now Ruby moved slowly, her hand always bracing her lower back, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The baby growing inside her remained her only source of light, the one reason she got up each day and smiled at her grandchildren when they asked, "Grandma, are you okay?" She lied well. Years of holding others up had made her an expert. In the first week, the reality of what Horace had done fully unfolded. Tanisha, who worked as a nurse, spent her evenings digging through legal documents, bank records, and the trail of wreckage her stepfather had left behind. Ruby watched her daughter move with fury, like a woman trying to patch a sinking ship with bare hands. Horace hadn't just disappeared. He had erased her. The house Ruby had lived in for 30 years was gone, sold to a property firm 2 days before she arrived in Savannah. The sale had been legal. On paper. The signature on the deed transfer was hers, though Ruby had never seen it before in her life. A power of attorney form had been filed 6 months prior. It stated that Ruby, due to cognitive decline and impaired mental state, had given Horace full control over all shared property. The signature looked like hers, but Ruby knew her own hand, and that swooping B in brown was wrong. Her bank account had been drained. The modest retirement savings she'd worked decades to build vanished into accounts she had no access to. Her pension had been rerouted. Even the insurance policy, one she'd kept untouched since the 1990s, had been canceled. "Why would he do this?" she whispered one night, not even expecting an answer. Tanisha didn't look up from her laptop. "Because he thought you'd go quietly." The betrayal was layered. Horace had waited until Ruby's vulnerability peaked. Pregnant, older, with no formal income. He had ensured she was isolated and then struck. A slow, deliberate erasure. And the worst part? He had succeeded. The day she opened her purse and realized she had no access to her own identity, no house key, no bank card, no legal claim to anything, was the day Ruby understood she had truly been discarded. But she wasn't dead. On the 3rd Sunday after her return, Tanisha took her to a women's legal aid clinic. The office was small and smelled of old carpet and printer toner, but the woman who greeted them, Clarissa James, wore a fire in her eyes Ruby hadn't seen in months. Clarissa specialized in financial abuse, especially among elderly women. She listened carefully as Ruby told her story. There were no tears, just the flat recounting of facts, how she'd been left in Savannah, how the house had been sold, the forged signatures, the frozen accounts. When Ruby finished, Clarissa looked her in the eye and said, You have a case, and we're going to make sure he regrets underestimating you." For the first time since she'd gotten off the bus, Ruby felt her spine straighten. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, affidavits, and evidence collection. Ruby had to recount every bank visit, every document she had signed, or hadn't. Clarissa submitted an emergency injunction to freeze any remaining assets and to challenge the legality of the divorce that Horace had filed in a quiet, out-of-state court. He hadn't served her properly. He hadn't even waited for her signature. The judge, surprisingly, responded quickly. A temporary order was granted. All assets to be frozen pending review, Horace required to appear in court, and Ruby's legal identity restored. But that didn't mean life went back to normal. Ruby remained in Tanisha's cramped living room. The baby grew heavier inside her. Her back ached. Her ankles swelled. The emotional toll seeped into her bones, into her breath, into the way she paused before speaking, as if every sentence had to be inspected for cracks before it was safe to speak aloud. She couldn't cook like she used to. She couldn't walk far. She didn't sleep through the night. And worst of all, the shame wrapped around her like a second skin. When she walked to the corner store with Tanisha's youngest, people stared, not with judgment, but with pity. That was worse. They all knew. The community that once praised her now whispered behind hands and church bulletins. "Did you hear what Horace did? I thought she was smarter than that. You'd think at her age she'd know better." Ruby smiled at the cashier, nodded at the old deacon on the bench outside the liquor store, and kept walking. One evening, as Tanisha folded laundry, Ruby sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. "I feel like I'm already a ghost," she murmured. Tanisha turned, startled. "Mama?" "I'm serious. I've got no home, no name, no money. I'm dependent on my child to eat and sleep. This ain't what I planned." "You were betrayed. That doesn't make you weak." Ruby nodded slowly. "No, but it sure makes me tired." That night, she opened her prayer journal again, the same one she had started when she learned about the baby. Her handwriting was shakier now, her words more cautious. But she wrote something new. "If you've left me standing, God, then you must mean for me to walk." It wasn't a declaration of war, not yet, but it was movement, a first step out of the rubble. She read it again and again. The baby kicked softly, as if in agreement. In the morning, Ruby rose early. Tanisha was still asleep. The house was quiet. She shuffled into the kitchen, wrapped herself in a cardigan, and stood at the counter. She opened the cupboard and stared at the flour, the sugar, the cinnamon. Old friends. Her fingers moved without thought, her body finding an old rhythm it had nearly forgotten. She didn't have a bakery anymore. She didn't have a kitchen big enough to swing a cat, but she had hands. She had memory, and she had hunger for something more than survival. By the time Tanisha came into the kitchen with sleep in her eyes and her scrubs halfway zipped, the air smelled like nutmeg and brown butter. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ruby didn't look up. She was pressing dough into a pie pan. "Building something from ashes," she said quietly. "Just watch." The first pie wasn't perfect. The crust was a bit too thick, the filling a little too sweet. Ruby hadn't baked with this kind of oven before. Electric, temperamental, and with a door that didn't close quite right. The heat didn't spread evenly, but it didn't matter. It was the first thing she'd made with her own two hands since the day Horace left. Tanisha came home that evening with the smell already curling down the hall. Her children had raced ahead, following the scent like bloodhounds, and were already crowded around the kitchen table when she stepped inside. "Sweet potato?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Ruby nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Close enough." Tanisha broke into a smile, equal parts awe and grief. "You're cooking again." "I'm remembering who I was." It started slow. One pie turned into two. She borrowed muffin tins from the lady down the hall and whipped up banana nut loaves. She learned which corner market sold the ripest peaches. People started knocking. Neighbors, old church folks who heard whispers, even the building supervisor. Word was spreading. Miss Ruby was baking again. By week's end, Tanisha cleared off the folding table in the dining nook and helped Ruby set up a little display. A hand-painted cardboard sign read, "Brown Sugar Bakes, Pay What You Can." Some days the table was empty by noon. Other days the loaves lingered. But Ruby didn't care. What mattered was the act. The kneading, the folding, the warm swell of scent that filled the apartment and pushed out the weight of betrayal like an exorcism. She wasn't healed, but she was working the wound. One morning, Tanisha returned home to find Ruby perched at the window with a notebook open, sketching logos. "You trying to start a real business?" her daughter asked. Ruby didn't look up. "No, I'm trying to remember I'm still capable of building one." The notebook soon filled with scribbles, menus, names, costs of flour in bulk, shipping timelines for labels. Ruby called her old friend, Miss Thelma, who ran a soup kitchen on the south side, and asked if she could use the church ovens on Saturday mornings. Thelma laughed for 5 whole seconds. "I thought you was dead, woman." "Just sleeping," Ruby replied, "but I'm wide awake now." By month's end, Ruby was selling out every weekend. People came not just for the pies, but to see her. See the woman who'd been left for broke and bounced back with a spatula and a prayer. One customer, a local food blogger named Shauna, posted a photo of her holding a pecan tart with the caption, "This 65-year-old queen bakes better than your grandma, left with nothing. Built everything back one pie at a time. #Black Excellence #Resilience." The post went viral. Orders began pouring in. Emails from nearby states. Messages asking if she shipped. Someone offered to build her a free website. Another offered to help her apply for a micro-grant from a women's entrepreneurship fund. Ruby stared at the screen, stunned. "Lord," she whispered, "is this what rising from the dead feels like?" But even as her world grew brighter, the shadows didn't vanish. Court proceedings loomed. Horace had finally responded, through a lawyer, cold and formal. He denied wrongdoing, claimed she'd consented to everything, produced signed documents Ruby had never seen in her life. "They're gonna drag me through the dirt," she told Clarissa. Clarissa adjusted her glasses. "Let them. We'll be standing when the dust settles." But it still wore on her. The fear, the old ache, the shame, the growing belly that twisted with nerves some nights. She'd been abandoned, not just as a wife, but as a woman, as a mother, as a human being. And yet, each morning, she got up and folded butter into dough like it was a sacred act. Each night, she rubbed her belly and whispered, "We're doing this, you and me." Then came the reporter. It was Shauna's post that did it. A producer from a regional station reached out, asking if she'd do a human interest segment, a Georgia grandmother's comeback. Ruby hesitated. "I'm not trying to be a spectacle." "You're not," Tanisha said. "You're a testimony." The interview aired a week later. It wasn't flashy, just Ruby at her folding table, apron dusted with flour, talking about rebuilding. She mentioned nothing about Horace, only that she had survived a sudden hardship and was making peace through pies. The response was overwhelming. Orders tripled overnight. Strangers mailed thank-you notes. A woman from Michigan sent baby clothes with a handwritten card that read, "You reminded me I'm not too old to begin again." Clarissa called her 2 days later. Horace's lawyer just requested a settlement discussion. Ruby exhaled slowly. "He's scared," Clarissa said. "He's seen the tide turn." The court granted our request for a full review of the divorce documents. "If we prove forgery and fraud, you could get everything back." Everything? The house, the pension, even damages. Ruby didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want it all." "What do you want then?" "I want him to know he didn't end me. I want him to see I rose." The next Saturday, she hosted a pop-up bake sale outside the church. She brought chairs and played gospel records from an old Bluetooth speaker. Kids danced in the street. Tanisha wore a shirt that read, "Born of brown sugar and backbone." Ruby stood behind the table, radiant, hand on her belly, greeting each customer like an old friend. She was no longer the woman who stumbled off a Greyhound bus weeks earlier. She was someone new, someone forged in the fire and tempered in the kitchen, someone who had learned that even when everything is taken from you, what's inside you can still rise. Flower, hope, and all. The day Ruby sat across from Clarissa in the wood-paneled office, rain slicking down the window, it stopped feeling like just a personal disaster. It became a legal war. Clarissa Bishop wasn't flashy. She didn't wear bold suits or lean on dramatic speeches. But there was a weight in her words, like every sentence was a nail being driven with intention. She'd seen dozens of cases like Ruby's, but something in Ruby's eyes made her sit forward and say, "We don't just defend your name. We take it back." The first step was sorting the mess Horace had left behind. The documents filed in Mississippi were riddled with errors. According to those papers, Ruby had voluntarily relinquished her share of the house and pension. Her consent to divorce was signed and notarized on a date she could prove she was in a hospital recovering from stress-induced complications. There were other things, too. Her name missing from bank account closures, her signature forged on a property deed, and the most galling of all, a sworn statement from Horace claiming Ruby had mental lapses that made her unfit to make financial decisions. He hadn't just walked out. He had tried to erase her. Clarissa laid out a timeline. First, they would file a petition in Georgia to contest jurisdiction over the divorce, claiming Ruby had never been served and that the out-of-state judgment was invalid. Next, they would gather evidence of financial fraud, starting with the power of attorney Horace had manipulated during her illness, allowing him to move assets without her awareness. Finally, they would seek a court injunction to freeze any remaining assets until the matter could be settled properly. "Horace played dirty," Clarissa said, "but we play smart." Meanwhile, Ruby's story continued spreading. The news segment had been clipped and reshared across platforms. Church groups invited her to speak. Women messaged her from all over, sharing their own stories of betrayal, of late-life abandonment, of men who underestimated their strength. But even as the spotlight grew, so did the attacks. It started online. Horace, or someone acting for him, leaked rumors. Anonymous posts appeared on forums and Facebook groups accusing Ruby of exaggeration, that she had always been controlling, that the baby might not be his, that she was using victimhood for attention. Ruby didn't respond, not publicly, but the whispers cut deep. They reminded her of being a girl in the South, told to be polite even when spit at, told to be strong, quiet, invisible. But this time, she had a voice. Clarissa filed a formal complaint against Horace's legal team for character defamation. She included screenshots of the smear posts and their links to accounts with matching IP addresses traced to Horace's hometown. Then came the hearing. Not the final trial, but a procedural session to review the jurisdictional challenge. Ruby arrived at the courthouse in a navy dress and low heels. Her belly had begun to swell noticeably. She walked with purpose, head high. Tanisha stood beside her in a quiet solidarity, arms folded, daring anyone to look at her mama sideways. Horace was there too. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still smooth, but the smoothness had cracked. He looked over at Ruby, and for the briefest moment, there was something like disbelief in his eyes. As if he hadn't expected her to really fight. As if he'd forgotten she was a lioness before she was anyone's wife. The judge asked direct questions. Why wasn't Ruby properly served? Why had Horace filed in another state knowing she'd returned to Georgia? Why had a power of attorney granted during illness been used to liquidate assets meant for both spouses? Horace's lawyer sputtered. Ruby and Clarissa sat calm. They had receipts. They had timelines. They had truth. The judge didn't make a final ruling that day, but he issued a temporary freeze on all remaining joint assets and scheduled a full hearing within the month. It was a beginning. When they stepped outside the courthouse, Clarissa handed Ruby a copy of the judge's order. "He can't touch a dime now," she said, "not without the court's permission." Ruby looked at the stamped document in her hands. It wasn't just paper. It was the first wall she'd built back. That night, Ruby went home and baked cornbread for the neighbors. She sang while stirring. Her hands moved without thought, but her mind was racing. Not with fear, but with focus. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman who'd been discarded and told to stay quiet. It was about the child growing inside her who would one day ask what she did when the world tried to erase her. And she would say, "I rose, I fought, I did not disappear." The next week brought more strategy meetings, more documentation, and finally, the confirmation they'd been waiting for. A forensic document expert verified that Ruby's signature on the property deed and financial waivers had been forged. Clarissa smiled when she read the report. Horace just stepped into his own trap. Ruby exhaled. Now what? Now we stop playing defense. Ruby's days began early now, long before the sun filtered through the sheer curtains of her bedroom window. Her body, still heavy with the weight of late pregnancy, often ached in the morning, but there was no time to rest. The lawsuit had turned from a desperate attempt to regain dignity into a full-scale reclamation of her name, her future, and her voice. Since the last hearing, something in Ruby had shifted, not softened. Strength had no softness to give, but sharpened. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to show Horace and every man like him that she had never needed to be rescued. She had only needed to be left the hell alone. Every morning started in the bakery. The smell of yeast, cinnamon, and brown sugar had become her grounding ritual. Though she still couldn't stand for long hours, she found ways to work efficiently, pacing herself, using a stool, accepting help when needed. Tanisha, after school, started taking on more and more responsibility, moving from the register to the oven under Ruby's watchful eye. The mother and daughter rarely needed words now. A nod, a look, a silent exchange that meant, "We're in this together." But the fire Ruby carried inside her wasn't only feeding loaves and pastries, it was building a legal storm. Clarissa worked tirelessly, uncovering deeper evidence of Horace's betrayal. The man hadn't just taken money. He'd rerouted pension checks, moved investment accounts into dummy LLCs, and sold a storage unit that contained all their shared property from 25 years of marriage. Wedding photos, family keepsakes, even the christening gown Ruby had worn as a baby. It was all gone. Liquidated. That detail hit harder than any dollar amount. One evening, Clarissa sat in the living room flipping through printouts as Ruby cradled her back and eased into the couch. "He tried to make you disappear," the lawyer said flatly, tapping a document. "This wasn't a divorce. It was a purge." Ruby didn't cry. Not anymore. But she did sit up straighter. "And now?" she asked. Clarissa slid over a thick packet with a tab marked for filing. "Now we file for damages, fraud, emotional distress, financial malfeasance, abusive process, and we call a forensic accountant to testify." The numbers were staggering. When Clarissa tallied up the assets Horace had touched, stolen, or hidden, the figure climbed into 6 figures. Combined with Ruby's current financial situation, the pregnancy, and her being left across state lines without ID or shelter, the court had little sympathy for Horace. Even less so when he responded with a new petition. Filed through a new attorney, his third, Horace now requested that all legal proceedings be postponed indefinitely due to mental instability and hormonal volatility on Ruby's part. The insult stung, not because she doubted her own sanity, but because she knew what it meant. He was still trying to control the narrative. Clarissa, however, was ready. They responded with documentation from Ruby's therapist and physician, confirming her mental fitness and emotional stability. They included medical records, emails, and court transcripts showing Ruby had been the consistent, stable party throughout the proceedings. They also attached another motion, this time for full custody once the child was born, citing Horace's refusal to acknowledge paternity and his public attempts to slander her while evading court-ordered tests. The final blow? A local nonprofit for elderly and financially abused women had picked up Ruby's story from the news and offered to fund an advocacy campaign. They planned to spotlight the legal loopholes men like Horace exploited, specifically the abusive power of attorney laws and interstate divorce filings used to isolate and rob women of everything they'd built. Suddenly, Ruby's story wasn't just personal, it was national. The bakery saw more foot traffic now, some curious, some supportive. A few nosy, wide-eyed women tried to squeeze gossip from Tanisha, but the girl had inherited her mother's fire. She answered with politeness and steel, "We're busy. If you want cookies, they're fresh. If you want a story, you can read the news." Ruby was proud, even as the stress began weighing heavier each night. Her feet swelled, her hips ached. But the baby, whom she'd started to call Justice in her mind, remained strong. Her belly shifted with powerful kicks. She told him stories at night, whispering against the warmth of her own skin, about love, loss, the smell of fresh bread, and the fight to never be silenced. Then came the subpoena. Horace was finally compelled to take the DNA test. Clarissa handed Ruby the letter like a trophy. "He has 7 days to comply, and if he refuses again, we move for default judgment." Ruby didn't cheer. She didn't grin. She just held the paper close, folded it, and tucked it into her grandmother's old Bible, the same one she'd carried since she was 16. "Let's see if he's still brave with a needle in his arm," she murmured. The test was scheduled for the following Monday. Horace appeared, late, flustered, sweating. He didn't meet Ruby's eyes, didn't speak a word, but Clarissa caught him watching her from the car window as they left. "I think he finally sees what he's up against," she said. The results would take 10 days, but Ruby didn't need a lab report to confirm what she already knew. Justice was hers. And every kick he gave her now felt like a drumbeat of victory. But Horace wasn't done. 2 days before the results were due, Clarissa received a desperate call from a colleague. Horace's new lawyer had filed an emergency appeal to have the DNA results sealed and suppressed, claiming they were inconclusive and potentially misleading. It was a last-ditch stunt. Clarissa responded with the force of someone who'd been underestimated too many times. She requested a hearing within 48 hours and filed a motion to unseal all evidence permanently. The judge agreed. And when the results came in, 99.999% paternity match, Ruby didn't even flinch. "I never needed his name," she told Clarissa quietly. "I just wanted it on record that he ran from his own blood." That weekend, Ruby slept for 12 hours straight, the first real rest she'd had since returning from Mississippi. When she woke up, the sun was streaming through the window. Tanisha had made breakfast. Neighbors had dropped off baby gifts. Someone had even left a card with just 4 words written in thick black pen: "You are not alone." Ruby stood before the courthouse steps at 8 a.m., her back straight despite the strain in her lower spine and the fatigue nesting behind her eyes. The morning air was crisp for late spring, and she wore a navy dress Clarissa had helped her pick, a clean, modest cut that gave her dignity without inviting pity. Her curls, now shot through with even more silver, were neatly pinned back. On her wrist was her mother's gold bracelet. On her lips, no smile, but something firmer: resolve. Inside the courtroom, the hum of whispers and shuffling papers filled the stale air. Ruby had been here before, but today was different. This was final hearing day. This was the reckoning. Clarissa stood beside her, calm and unreadable as always, a thick binder tucked beneath her arm labeled R. Johnson v. H. Johnson, Final Proceedings. Tanisha waited outside the courtroom, too young to attend, but old enough to understand what today meant. She had kissed her mother's cheek that morning and whispered, "We win this for all of us." The judge entered promptly at 9. An older black man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had clearly seen too much injustice. He didn't smile. Judges rarely did, but Ruby swore she saw something like recognition in the way he nodded at her. The courtroom wasn't packed, but enough people sat in the gallery to make it feel full. A few reporters, a couple of curious citizens, and Horace. He sat across the aisle, stone-faced, wearing a suit that didn't fit as well as it used to. His lawyer, the fourth since proceedings began, whispered rapidly into his ear, but Horace barely blinked. He hadn't looked Ruby in the eye in months, and he didn't now. Clarissa rose first. What followed was not a show, not a spectacle, but a precise dismantling of every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal Horace had constructed. She began with the power of attorney Ruby had signed during her IVF treatments. She explained how Horace had used it not for health emergencies, as it was intended, but to strip Ruby of every asset she had, financial, legal, and personal, while she was vulnerable and pregnant. Next came the trail of financial records, bank transfers into shell corporations, the illegal sale of jointly owned property, the forged signature on a document that had allowed him to clean out her retirement savings, then the timeline of abandonment, Mississippi, no warning, no ID, no return ticket, a pregnant woman left across state lines like discarded luggage. Clarissa paused often, not for effect, but to allow the weight of each detail to land. Her voice never rose, but her presence filled the courtroom. When she laid the DNA results before the judge, proof that Justice was Horace's child, undeniably, she let the paper sit in silence for a full 5 seconds before continuing. And then, finally, came the public defamation. Screenshots of Horace's social media posts, messages he had sent to mutual friends, framing Ruby as unstable, deceitful, manipulative, posts implying she had lied about her pregnancy, accusations that now stood in direct contradiction to both the lab results and his own participation in their fertility treatments. When she finished, the courtroom was so quiet Ruby could hear the judge's pen tapping against his legal pad. Then, Horace's lawyer rose. He tried to frame the story as a breakdown in communication, claimed Horace had panicked during the pregnancy, cited stress, financial anxiety, even suggested that Ruby had encouraged distance by focusing entirely on motherhood and leaving Horace to feel isolated. He spoke for 10 minutes. Clarissa had spoken for 45. Finally, the judge looked up. He removed his glasses and folded his hands. "Mr. Johnson," he said, voice level but hard as granite, "do you understand what this court has just heard?" Horace swallowed, then nodded once. "You used legal documents to abandon your pregnant wife in another state. You liquidated assets, slandered her name, and refused, on multiple occasions, to comply with court orders. You left her homeless and without identification while carrying your child, and only cooperated when threatened with court-enforced penalties. This is not a miscommunication. This is malicious abandonment." He turned to Ruby. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, voice gentler now, "you've endured the kind of betrayal most people would crumble under. But you stood, you rebuilt, and you protected the child both parties helped bring into this world. You've acted with integrity, consistency, and strength." He leaned back. "Here is the court's decision." The room seemed to hold its breath. The divorce is granted, but the terms filed in absentia by Mr. Johnson are hereby void. Full marital assets are to be restored to Mrs. Johnson, with damages awarded for emotional distress and fraudulent use of legal authority. Horace's jaw tensed. He still didn't look at Ruby. Custody of the child, Justice Johnson, is awarded solely to Mrs. Johnson. Mr. Johnson may not petition for visitation without undergoing a psychological evaluation, parenting course, and supervised meetings for no less than 6 months. Finally, the judge lifted the DNA results. "This court recognizes this child as yours, Mr. Johnson, but your behavior demonstrates no capacity to parent responsibly. You do not get to claim what you ran from." The gavel struck. Case closed. Ruby didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She simply stood, slowly, carefully, and nodded to the judge. Clarissa touched her elbow, a rare smile curving her lips. Outside, the reporters swarmed, but Ruby didn't speak. She walked straight down the courthouse steps to where Tanisha stood waiting, holding the car door open. "Is it over?" her daughter asked. Ruby shook her head. "No," she said, sliding into the seat. "It's just beginning." That night, she baked. Cinnamon rolls, sweet bread, honey-glazed biscuits. She wasn't baking for the customers this time. She was baking for herself, for Justice, for Tanisha, for every woman who'd ever been erased and forced to rebuild brick by brick. By morning, the bakery windows steamed with warmth and the smell of victory, and Ruby stood behind the counter, flour-dusted and radiant, with justice in a sling across her chest and fire still in her eyes. The years that followed the courtroom reckoning were not easy, but they were hers. Ruby Johnson, once a woman erased, displaced, discarded, had become more than just a survivor. She was a story told in low whispers and proud voices across her town. A symbol, a legend, not because she'd been abandoned, but because she had turned that abandonment into resurrection. Her bakery, once just an idea scribbled in a notebook during late nights and contractions, became a cornerstone of the community. Johnson's Hearth. Locals called it the Oven for short, a name that stuck like caramel to cooling pie. On any given day, people didn't just come for the cornbread or the pecan rolls. They came to see Ruby, to watch her behind the counter with flour on her cheek, baby Justice strapped to her back in the early days and then toddling through the kitchen as he grew. She baked hope into her bread. Her lemon loaves reminded people that bitterness could be sweetened. Her peach cobblers tasted like summer never ended. Her sweet potato pies were comfort in a crust, but it wasn't just the food that made people come back. It was the space she created, the way she welcomed the single mothers with their strollers and their exhaustion, the way she never flinched when someone couldn't pay in full, the way she always gave away the last loaf at closing time if someone knocked, cold and late. Ruby became known as the kitchen saint in the local papers. But when a national food columnist wandered into her bakery one November afternoon and tasted her cinnamon buns, the world took notice. The article, titled "The Woman Who Rose," went viral. They wanted her on morning shows. They offered to buy the rights to her story. Big brands asked if she'd consider franchising, but Ruby declined most of it. Because she wasn't building an empire, she was building a home. She did, however, write a book, half memoir, half cookbook, called Ashes to Bread. It became a bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. In it, she told the story of Horace, not with venom, but with clarity. She named what he did. She never softened it. But she also didn't let him define the ending. Because the real ending, she wrote, was Justice. Justice, who now ran through the aisles of the bakery, chubby and loud and radiant, who wore overalls and crumbled cookie crumbs into her paperwork, who called every customer baby because that's what he heard Ruby say. He was 5 when he asked, "Mama, who's my daddy?" Ruby paused, looked him in the eye, and told him, "Your daddy is a man who helped bring you here, but your family, that's everybody in this bakery, that's me, that's you, that's all the people who love you." Justice nodded, then asked for a cookie. She gave him 2. Tanisha eventually went back to school, got her degree, became a social worker specializing in domestic resilience cases. She credited her mother's strength in every scholarship essay, in every speech she was invited to give. And Ruby? She didn't stop. She began offering Sunday dinners at the bakery for women's shelters, built a mentoring program for women who were rebuilding their lives, some recently released from incarceration, others escaping abuse, all of them looking for a second chance. She taught them to need, to measure, to manage inventory. But more than that, she taught them to own space, to stop apologizing for taking up room. "You are not someone's leftover," she once told a tearful young mother. "You are the main course." Years passed. Her hair went from silver to snow white. Justice grew taller than her by 13. Tanisha bought a small home down the street. And still, Ruby showed up every morning at 6 a.m., turned on the lights, tied her apron, and started her day with gospel in the background and a prayer in her heart. She never remarried. She never needed to, because what she built outlived heartbreak. On her 70th birthday, the town held a block party outside the bakery. There were speeches, banners, confetti cannons. Even the mayor showed up. But Ruby's favorite part was when Justice stood on a chair, tapped his fork against a glass, and asked to say something. "My mama," he said, voice clear and strong, "didn't just teach me how to bake. She taught me how to stay standing when everything in the world tried to make her kneel." Silence fell, and then applause. Ruby wiped a tear from her cheek, leaned over, and kissed her son's temple. That night, after everyone had gone, she stayed behind to sweep the floor one last time before locking up. The moonlight spilled through the windows. The scent of cinnamon still lingered. And Ruby whispered into the silence, "We're safe now." She meant more than herself. She meant every woman who had ever been left behind and still rose. Every child who ever questioned if they were wanted. Every lioness who had ever been mistaken for prey. Because she hadn't just survived. She had turned her survival into legacy. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Someone you know might need to hear this. So please share this video with a friend or loved one. And if you're ready for more powerful stories like this, click on one of the videos on your screen now. You won't want to miss what's coming next.